The phone rang 3 days after I buried my husband, and before I even lifted it, I knew my life was about to fracture again. Grief has a sound, a pressure behind the ears, and when I heard that ring cutting through my silent kitchen, my chest tightened like a warning bell. I was still wearing black, still smelling of soil and wilted flowers, still counting breaths to survive each hour. When I answered, a man spoke my name as if it were a liability. He said, "Mrs. Julia Hale, this is Victor Rowan. You knew me as your husband's employer." His voice was controlled, expensive, the kind that never shook. Then he said the words that froze the air around me. "You need to come here immediately. I have something to show you, and listen carefully. Do not tell your children. If you do, you'll be putting them in danger." In that moment, grief stepped aside, and fear took its place. If you want to hear how a 72-year-old widow walked into a trap meant to erase her family and walked out with her children alive, make sure you subscribe now, because this story only grows darker from here. I didn't tell my daughter or my son. I hated myself for that fear is a cruel commander. Victor Rowan was a man whose name appeared on buildings, scholarships, hospital wings. My husband had worked for him for nearly 30 years, driving him, managing private errands, keeping secrets I never asked about. Victor gave the eulogy at the funeral, his hand heavy on my shoulder, his eyes dry. Now he wanted me alone. I stared at my phone long after the call ended, then locked the door, pulled on a gray coat, and told myself I was just going to listen. His estate sat outside the city like a fortress, iron gates opening silently as my cab approached. I paid the driver and stood there, heart-thudding, wondering why a rich man needed secrecy from a grandmother who baked cookies every Sunday. Inside, everything smelled of polished wood and old money. Victor greeted me with a nod, not a hug. "Thank you for coming quickly," he said, already turning. We walked down a long corridor lined with photographs of powerful men smiling beside him. I noticed my husband in one of them, half in shadow, eyes wary. Victor stopped before a closed door at the end of the hall. "Before you see this," he said quietly, "you need to understand that your husband died because of what he knew." My knees weakened, but I stayed upright. He opened the door. A man stood inside, tall, broad, his face carved with scars that told stories of violence without words. His eyes met mine, and something cold recognized me. I had seen that face once before, years ago, in a courthouse hallway. When my husband testified in a sealed hearing, he never explained. The man smiled, slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I was hoping you'd come." The room felt too small to hold my breath. Victor stepped back, leaving me alone with the man who had murdered my husband, though I did not yet know how or why. "You killed him," I whispered, not as an accusation, but as a fact that finally found language. The man tilted his head. "Your husband made a choice," he replied. "Now you have one." Victor's voice drifted from the hallway. "This is where I step out," he said. "What happens next determines whether your children sleep safely tonight." The door closed. I wanted to scream, to claw at the walls, to demand answers, but something steadier rose inside me. I had survived childbirth, poverty, loss, decades of being underestimated. I took a deep breath and met the killer's eyes. "You're here because you think I'm weak," I said. He laughed softly. "I'm here because you're connected." He explained that my husband had kept copies of documents exposing crimes that reached far beyond Victor's empire. When my husband refused to hand them over, he was silenced. Now they needed to be sure no backups existed. "Your children," the man said casually, "are leverage." I felt the shape of fear change. It sharpened into resolve. I thought of my daughter's laugh, my son's stubborn kindness, I thought of the way my husband used to squeeze my hand twice when words were dangerous. "You won't touch them," I said. The man stepped closer. "That depends on you." I realized then that Victor hadn't called me to warn me. He had called me to test me, to see if grief had hollowed me out enough to comply. He was wrong. I asked for time, pretending uncertainty, asking questions that made the man talk. He boasted. He always did, men like him. He revealed locations, names, timelines. I listened, memorizing every detail, filing it away. Knew the estate had cameras, guards, records. Victor believed himself untouchable. That arrogance was my opening. When the man finally leaned back, satisfied, I said quietly, "My husband trusted the wrong people. I won't." Somewhere an alarm chimed. The man frowned. Victor rushed back in, phone pressed to his ear, color draining from his face. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. I had triggered the silent emergency button beneath the antique desk when the man wasn't looking, a relic my husband once showed me, joking that rich men feared other rich men most. The killer lunged, but guards flooded the room. Chaos erupted. Through it all, I stood still, heart racing, knowing my children were safe because I had faced the danger head-on instead of running from it. The phone rang 3 days after I buried my husband, and before I even lifted it, I knew my life was about to fracture again. Grief has a sound, a pressure behind the ears, and when I heard that ring cutting through my silent kitchen, my chest tightened like a warning bell. I was still wearing black, still smelling of soil and wilted flowers, still counting breaths to survive each hour. When I answered, a man spoke my name as if it were a liability. He said, "Mrs. Julia Hale, this is Victor Rowan. You knew me as your husband's employer." His voice was controlled, expensive, the kind that never shook. Then he said the words that froze the air around me. "You need to come here immediately. I have something to show you. And listen carefully. Do not tell your children. If you do, you'll be putting them in danger." In that moment, grief stepped aside, and fear took its place. If you want to hear how a 72-year-old widow walked into a trap meant to erase her family and walked out with her children alive, make sure you subscribe now, because this story only grows darker from here. I didn't tell my daughter or my son. I hated myself for that, but fear is a cruel commander. Victor Rowan was a man whose name appeared on buildings, scholarships, hospital wings. My husband had worked for him for nearly 30 years, driving him, managing private errands, keeping secrets I never asked about. Victor gave the eulogy at the funeral, his hand heavy on my shoulder, his eyes dry. Now he wanted me alone. I stared at my phone long after the call ended, then locked the door, pulled on a gray coat, and told myself I was just going to listen. His estate sat outside the city like a fortress, iron gates opening silently as my cab approached. I paid the driver and stood there, heart thudding, wondering why a rich man needed secrecy from a grandmother who baked cookies every Sunday. Inside, everything smelled of polished wood and old money. Victor greeted me with a nod, not a hug. "Thank you for coming quickly," he said, already turning. We walked down a long corridor, lined with photographs of powerful men smiling beside him. I noticed my husband in one of them, half in shadow, eyes wary. Victor stalked before a closed door at the end of the hall. "Before you see this," he said quietly, "you need to understand that your husband died because of what he knew." My knees weakened, but I stayed upright. He opened the door. A man stood inside, tall, broad, his face carved with scars that told stories of violence, without words. His eyes met mine, and something cold recognized me. I had seen that face once before, years ago, in a courthouse hallway. When my husband testified in a sealed hearing, he never explained. The man smiled, slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I was hoping you'd come." The room felt too small to hold my breath. Victor stepped back, leaving me alone with the men who had murdered my husband, though I did not yet know how or why. "You killed him," I whispered, not as an accusation, but as a fact that finally found language. The man tilted his head. "Your husband made a choice," he replied. "Now you have one." Victor's voice drifted from the hallway. "This is where I step out," he said. "What happens next determines whether your children sleep safely tonight." The door closed. I wanted to scream, to claw at the walls, to demand answers. But something steadier rose inside me. I had survived childbirth, poverty, loss, decades of being underestimated. I took a deep breath and met the killer's eyes. "You're here because you think I'm weak," I said. He laughed softly. "I'm here because you're connected." He explained that my husband had kept copies of documents, exposing crimes that reached far beyond Victor's empire. When my husband refused to hand them over, he was silenced. Now they needed to be sure no backups existed. "Your children," the man said casually, "are leverage." I felt the shape of fear change. It sharpened into resolve. I thought of my daughter's laugh, my son's stubborn kindness. I thought of the way my husband used to squeeze my hand twice when words were dangerous. "You won't touch them," I said. The man stepped closer. "That depends on you." I realized then that Victor hadn't called me to warn me. He had called me to test me, to see if grief had hollowed me out enough to comply. He was wrong. I asked for time, pretending uncertainty, asking questions that made the man talk. He boasted. He always did, men like him. He revealed locations, names, timelines. I listened, memorizing every detail, filing it away. I knew the estate had cameras, guards, records. Victor believed himself untouchable. That arrogance was my opening. When the man finally leaned back, satisfied, I said quietly, "My husband trusted the wrong people. I won't." Somewhere, an alarm chimed. The man frowned. Victor rushed back in, phone pressed to his ear, color draining from his face. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. I had triggered the silent emergency button beneath the antique desk when the man wasn't looking. A relic my husband once showed me, joking that rich men feared other rich men most. The killer lunged, but guards flooded the room. Chaos erupted. Through it all, I stood still, heart racing, knowing my children were safe, because I had faced the danger head-on instead of running from it. They separated us quickly, hands firm but respectful on my arms, as if I were fragile porcelain, instead of a woman vibrating with adrenaline. The killer was forced to the floor, shouting promises that sounded like curses dressed as certainty. Victor disappeared into another corridor, already rehearsing denials. I was led into a quiet sitting room, offered water I didn't drink, questions I didn't answer yet. When the police arrived, the house transformed from a monument to power into a maze of evidence tape and murmurs. I sat upright, spine straight, thinking of my husband and the way he used to say that truth moves slowly, but it always arrives. They took my statement as the sky outside dimmed into evening. I told them everything I had learned in that room. Every name, every location, every threat. An older detective watched me closely, not unkindly. as if recalibrating his understanding of who I was. "Your husband was trying to protect you," he said. I nodded. "And our children," I replied. When they finally drove me home, an unmarked car followed, protection I never imagined needing. I stood in my doorway for a long moment, listening to the familiar creaks of my house, breathing in safety like a scent. I told my children that night, not everything, but enough. My daughter cried, my son paced, anger flashing hot and bright. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" he demanded. I held his face in my hands. "Because fear lies," I said, "and because sometimes a mother has to walk into the dark alone to keep the light on at home." They stayed with me, sleeping in their childhood rooms, the house alive again with movement and whispers. The next days unfolded like a careful unspooling. News broke quietly, then loudly. Victor Rowan was questioned, then charged. The man who killed my husband was revealed to be part of a network that fed on silence. Documents surfaced, exactly as my husband promised they would, copies hidden in places only patience could protect. I learned how close he had come to turning back, how often he had written notes to himself about courage and consequence. I found one tucked inside a book he loved, a simple line underlined twice: "Do the right thing, even when it costs you." Threats came, then stopped. Power shifted. The detective checked in regularly. The unmarked car stayed until it didn't need to. One afternoon, I stood in my kitchen making soup, the most ordinary act in the world, and realized my hands were steady again. Grief still lived in me, but it had learned to share space with purpose. Weeks later, I was asked to testify. The courtroom felt colder than the estate ever had. I spoke clearly, slowly, refusing to rush my truth. I watched Victor avoid my eyes, watched the killer stare through me as if I were already a ghost. I wasn't. I was a witness, a mother, a widow who refused to be erased. When it was over, my children flanked me, their shoulders solid at my sides. At home, I planted a small tree in the yard, something my husband always wanted but never found time for. We pressed the soil down together, hands dirty, laughing unexpectedly at nothing. Life didn't return to what it was. It became something braver. I learned that danger doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it calls politely and asks you to come alone. And sometimes the quietest voice in the room belongs to the person who decides to stand anyway. In the months that followed, life moved with a strange double rhythm. One beat ordinary and the other edged with vigilance. I returned to routines because routines insist on survival. I watered the new tree each morning, counted pills into weekly boxes, folded laundry while the radio murmured. Yet beneath those simple acts ran a current of awareness that never slept. When the phone rang, I listened differently. When footsteps passed my gate, I noted their cadence. It wasn't paranoia, it was education. Fear had taught me how to pay attention without surrendering joy, and I clung to that balance like a skill learned late but mastered quickly. Investigators came and went, always courteous, sometimes grateful. They asked about my husband's habits, the routes he took, the conversations he ended abruptly. I told them about the way he kept his keys aligned, the way he paused before answering questions he couldn't lie about. I shared the last ordinary evening we had, soup cooling on the stove, a documentary neither of us watched. He had squeezed my hand twice. I finally understood why. Those small details mattered now, woven into a larger truth that needed every thread. My children adjusted in their own ways. My daughter grew quieter, channeling worry into lists and plans, making meals for neighbors who had done the same for us. My son began walking the perimeter each night, checking locks with the seriousness of a vow. We talked more than we used to. About money, about choices, about the difference between bravery and recklessness. I told them that courage doesn't roar. It whispers instructions you must choose to follow. They listened, even when they disagreed, and that was enough. The trial dates were set, then delayed, then set again. Time stretched. The media circled and moved on, bored by complexity. Victor's lawyers spoke of misunderstandings and overreach. The killer's attorney argued coercion. I watched these maneuvers from my living room, tea cooling untouched, and felt the old anger flare. It didn't consume me, it fueled me. I wrote statements at my dining table, letters to officials who still believed influence outweighed evidence. Some never replied. Others did, quietly, promising diligence. Quiet promises can be powerful when kept. One afternoon, a young woman knocked on my door. She introduced herself as a journalist who had followed the case from the beginning. She asked for an interview. I studied her face, searching for sensation disguised as concern. "Why now?" I asked. She answered honestly. "Because people think the danger is over," she said, "and it isn't. Not for families like yours." I agreed to speak on record, choosing words that honored my husband without turning him into a martyr. I spoke about systems that reward silence and the cost paid by those who refuse it. The article ran 2 days later, measured and clear. It brought support and scrutiny in equal measure. A week after that, I received a letter without a return address. Inside was a single page with a line typed in block letters, an attempt at intimidation that felt tired rather than terrifying. I showed it to the detective, who nodded. "They're rattled," he said. "That's good." I placed the letter beneath the tree in the yard. Let rain soften the ink until it bled into nothing. Let threats dissolve into mulch. At night, sleep came unevenly. Dreams replayed the moment the door opened at the estate, the way the killer's smile sharpened the air. I learned to wake myself gently, to breathe until the present reasserted itself. In those quiet hours, I spoke to my husband, telling him about the tree's new leaves, about our children's small victories. I didn't ask for guidance. I thanked him for trust. Trust had carried me farther than fear ever could. When the trial finally resumed, testimony unfolded with methodical patience. Experts mapped financial trails like constellations, revealing patterns that could not be coincidence. The killer's bravado wilted under cross-examination. Victor's composure cracked, just once, when a ledger appeared on a screen and the room seemed to inhale. I watched that moment and felt no triumph, only relief. Accountability is not revenge. It is repair. After the verdicts were read, I stood outside the courthouse with my children, the air bright and sharp. Reporters shouted questions we did not answer. We walked to our car together, hands brushing, connected by a shared understanding that danger had been faced and named. Life would continue to test us, as it does everyone, but we had learned how to stand when asked to kneel. That evening, I cooked my husband's favorite meal and set an extra place at the table. We ate slowly, laughing when the sauce reduced too much, forgiving mistakes easily. Later, I wrote in a notebook I kept for moments that mattered. A simple entry, dated and signed. I wrote that courage had visited our house and found us willing. I closed the book, turned off the light, and slept, knowing vigilance and peace could coexist if I chose them both. The weeks after the verdict settled into a quieter pattern. But quiet did not mean simple. Justice had a way of rearranging lives, and ours needed rearranging gently. I found myself sorting through my husband's things with a new patience. touching each object as if it were a sentence he never finished. His jacket still held the shape of his shoulders. In a drawer, I found a small notebook filled with observations about people he met through work. Careful and unemotional, a map of trust and caution. I understood then how long he had carried this burden alone, how he had shielded us, not with walls, but with preparation. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and questions they didn't quite ask. Some spoke in whispers, others in admiration that embarrassed me. I accepted kindness without turning it into currency. Being seen had its costs. Being known was riskier than being invisible, but invisibility had almost killed us. I learned to choose the middle ground, to live openly without advertising my fear. My daughter decided to move closer, trading a longer commute for the comfort of shared dinners. My son took a leave from work, saying he wanted time to recalibrate his priorities. We discussed boundaries like a family learning a new language, who answered unknown calls, which routes we took, how to live fully without tempting fate. These conversations were not heavy. They were practical, anchored in love rather than anxiety. One afternoon, a package arrived from an address I didn't recognize. Inside was a framed photograph of my husband standing beside a lake, his smile unguarded, younger than I remembered him. A note accompanied it, unsigned, thanking him for choosing truth when it mattered. I sat at the table and let the tears come, the kind that rinse rather than drown. He had not been alone in his choices, after all. The journalist returned once more, asking how it felt now that the danger had receded. I told her danger never truly recedes. It transforms. But so does courage, I added. She nodded, scribbling, and I wondered how many stories like ours lived half-told because fear preferred silence. When the piece ran, messages arrived from strangers who had made their own difficult choices. I replied to some, careful not to become a symbol when I was simply a person who refused to bend. I began volunteering at a local community center, helping seniors navigate paperwork and technology. It grounded me to be useful in small ways. People trusted me with their passwords and worries, their quiet frustrations. In helping them, I helped myself. Purpose stitched the days together. At home, the tree in the yard took root firmly, its leaves glossy and determined. We hung a small wind chime on its lowest branch. When it rang, the sound reminded me that movement could be gentle and still be strong. On evenings when the sky turned copper, I sat beneath it and read aloud from books my husband loved, believing that memory listens when given a voice. Not everything was resolved. Appeals were filed. Rumors surfaced and faded. Occasionally, a car slowed near the house. Curiosity or coincidence? I couldn't say. I noted it, reported it when necessary, and went on with my evening. Vigilance became a habit, not a prison. One night, my son asked me if I had been afraid when I walked into the estate that day. I thought carefully before answering. Yes, I said, but fear isn't the opposite of bravery. It's the invitation. He smiled, the tension easing from his shoulders, and I knew the lesson had landed. As seasons shifted, anniversaries arrived. The day my husband died passed with quiet acknowledgement, a candle lit, stories shared. The day I answered the phone passed with resolve, a reminder of how quickly lives can pivot. I didn't regret going. Regret belongs to the roads not taken, and that road led us back to ourselves. Late one evening, I opened my notebook and wrote again, slower this time. I wrote about the call, the warning, the door. I wrote about standing still, when running would have been easier. I wrote about saving my children, not with force, but with clarity. When I finished, I felt lighter, as if setting the words down allowed me to carry them without strain. I turned off the light and listened to the wind chime sing softly outside. Tomorrow would bring ordinary tasks and unforeseen challenges. I would meet them as I had learned to do, eyes open, heart steady, choosing truth, even when it cost me comfort. That choice had saved my family once. It would guide us again. By the time the 5th month arrived, the story everyone else thought they knew had settled into a thinner version of the truth. Headlines shortened complex courage into convenient sound bites. People nodded at me in grocery store aisles with sympathetic eyes, then returned to choosing fruit. That was fine. Survival does not require an audience. It requires continuity. I focused on that instead, on stitching days together so they formed something livable. I began volunteering at the community library, shelving books with histories heavier than mine, finding comfort in how stories wait patiently to be reopened. The legal aftermath dragged on in quieter corridors. Appeals were filed, motions argued, consequences negotiated in rooms where my name was just another line on a docket. I attended when I was needed and stayed away when I wasn't. I learned that presence is powerful, but absence can be strategic. My children resumed their lives in careful arcs. My daughter accepted a new job across town, closer to home by design rather than fear. My son returned to school, carrying vigilance like a folded coat he could put on or take off. We checked in nightly, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. One evening, as autumn leaned into winter, the detective called with an update that felt final in a way nothing had before. "They won't be coming back at you," he said. "Not directly. The network is dismantled enough now that retaliation would only expose what's left." I thanked him and hung up, letting the quiet settle. Safety, I learned, is rarely absolute. It is cumulative, built from choices layered over time. We had earned enough layers to breathe. I found myself thinking more about Victor than I expected, not with hatred, but with curiosity. Power had insulated him until it didn't. I wondered how many warnings he had ignored, because consequence always arrived for other people. My husband had known that story too well. He chose a different ending. I honored that choice by refusing bitterness. Bitterness narrows the future. I wanted mine wide. The tree in the yard survived its first frost. Its branches were bare, but resilient, roots taking hold beneath the surface where strength prefers to work. I wrapped its trunk in burlap and smiled at the small ritual, an act of care without drama. On the anniversary of my husband's death, we gathered quietly, just us, sharing memories that made us laugh more than cry. I told them stories they had never heard, moments when he failed spectacularly and learned quickly. We toasted with tea and promised to keep telling the truth, even when it was inconvenient. A letter arrived from a woman whose name I didn't recognize. She wrote that her brother had worked briefly for Victor, that he had disappeared after asking the wrong questions. The case had given her the courage to reopen his file. She thanked me for standing when others couldn't. I wrote back, careful and honest, telling her that courage multiplies when shared. We corresponded for months, two strangers connected by loss and resolve. Sometimes healing travels sideways before it moves forward. I was invited to speak at a small forum about whistleblowers and families left behind. I hesitated, then accepted. On the stage, under soft lights, I told the story without spectacle. I spoke about the phone call, the warning, the door, and the choice to face what waited there. I spoke about being underestimated and how that can be an advantage. When I finished, the room was quiet in a way that felt respectful rather than stunned. People lined up afterward, not for photos, but to say thank you, to say me too. I went home lighter. There were still nights when memory ambushed me, when the image of that scarred smile returned uninvited. On those nights, I got up and made tea, grounding myself in small motions. I reminded myself that danger had knocked and been answered. That matters. It changes the math of fear. I taught my grandchildren how to plant bulbs for spring, how to trust that something unseen is working if you tend it. They asked why we cover the soil. I told them it's to keep the cold from stealing the future. As the year closed, I reviewed documents one last time, ensuring everything my husband protected was now where it belonged. I donated what we didn't need, funded scholarships in quiet ways, chose transparency over secrecy whenever I could. Legacy, I realized, isn't what you leave behind. It's what you set in motion. My husband had set something difficult and necessary in motion. I kept it moving. On a clear winter morning, I stood at the window and watched my children leave together, laughing at something trivial. The sound carried, bright and ordinary. I pressed my palm to the glass and breathed. The world hadn't become safer. I had become stronger within it, and that finally was enough. The world did not snap back into place after the verdicts. Instead, it settled differently, like furniture rearranged after a storm, familiar yet permanently shifted. I found myself noticed in ways I never had been before. Strangers recognized me at the market, their looks filled with curiosity or quiet respect. Some thanked me for speaking when others stayed silent. Others looked away, reminded that danger can live behind polished doors. I accepted both reactions without explanation. Survival does not require justification. Financial matters followed, complicated and uncomfortable. Assets were frozen, accounts examined, contracts dissolved. My husband's modest savings stood in sharp contrast to the empire he had served, and that contrast angered me more than any threat ever had. I learned how close he had come to being compensated fairly, how often promises were dangled and withdrawn. I worked with lawyers who spoke gently, as if softness could cushion injustice. I insisted on clarity instead. Eventually, restitution came, not generous, but honest. I used it carefully, funding our future and supporting organizations that protected whistleblowers who lacked the safety net I had been forced to build mid-fall. My children began to reclaim parts of themselves set aside during crisis. My daughter enrolled in a program she had postponed, driven by a new sense of urgency. "If I wait for perfect safety," she said, "I'll never start." My son volunteered evenings at a community center, mentoring boys who mistook toughness for armor. Watching them move forward felt like watching wounds knit themselves closed. Slowly, deliberately, I received an invitation to speak at a small conference on corporate accountability. I nearly declined. Public stages felt exposed, unnecessary. Then I remembered the journalist's words, how danger fades when stories are buried. I accepted. Standing at a podium, light swarm on my face, I spoke not of villains, but of systems. Not of fear, but of choice. I told them that courage is rarely cinematic. It is repetitive, boring, exhausting. It shows up every day until truth has no room left to hide. Applause followed, polite and brief. The real work I knew would happen afterward, in quieter rooms. One evening, months later, I returned home to find my front gate open. My breath caught, old instincts flaring. I moved slowly, scanning shadows, heart steady despite itself. It turned out a neighbor had chased a stray dog from the yard and forgotten the latch. I laughed then, a sound that surprised me with its ease. Fear had taught me vigilance, but it no longer ruled me. That distinction mattered. I continued my conversations with the detective, now retired, over coffee. We spoke of cases that stayed with him, of compromises he regretted and lines he never crossed. "You reminded me why I joined," he said once, staring into his cup. I shook my head. "You reminded me that institutions are made of people," I replied. We toasted to that, a quiet acknowledgement of shared ground. The tree in the yard grew stronger, leaves thickening, roots deepening invisibly. I tended it with care, pruning when necessary, letting it weather storms without interference. It became a marker of time, a witness. Neighbors commented on it. Children played beneath it. Life layered itself around loss, not erasing it, but integrating it into something livable. Late one night, I found a final letter from my husband tucked behind a drawer panel I had never noticed. His handwriting was steady, intentional. He wrote about responsibility, about the temptation to look away, about love as a practice rather than a feeling. He apologized for the danger, thanked me for bravery he trusted but never wanted to test. I pressed the page to my chest and let myself cry fully, without fear of breaking. Grief, too, evolves. The following spring, charges expanded beyond the initial case. More arrests followed. Patterns exposed themselves. The ripple widened. I watched from a distance, no longer central, but still connected, like a stone whose throw continues to disturb water long after it sinks. I did not need to be visible for the impact to persist. On the anniversary of my husband's death, we gathered quietly. No speeches, no cameras, just family, food, and stories told without whispering. We spoke of his stubborn humor, his meticulous habits, his quiet kindness. When the sun dipped low, I stood beneath the tree and felt a calm certainty settle in me. The unknown man who had once threatened my family no longer held any power over my story. I had faced him, named him, and moved beyond him. I locked the house that night and checked the windows out of habit, not fear. I turned off the lights and paused before bed, listening to the silence that once terrified me, and now felt earned. Danger had knocked. I had answered. And in doing so, I had learned that survival is not the absence of threat, but the presence of resolve. Practice daily, until it becomes a way of life. The days after the trial became quieter, but the lessons stayed etched into every corner of our lives. Julia watched her children move through the world with a new awareness, a cautious respect for the shadows that sometimes follow the light. My daughter carried herself with confidence, but never arrogance. My son walked a little taller, not because of pride, but because he had witnessed what survival required. And I, Julia Hale, learned that age and loss do not preclude courage. They refine it. Each morning, as sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, I would pause at the window, tracing the branches of the small tree we had planted together, and I reminded myself that life is often fragile, but it can also endure even the sharpest knives of fate. We repaired what we could, not everything. Relationships that had frayed under the weight of secrecy and grief were slowly mended with patience, honest conversation, and the occasional argument. The house, once heavy with silence, filled with the warmth of everyday noise, dishes clanging, laughter echoing through hallways, footsteps on creaky stairs. Julia's heart, which had once pounded with fear and sorrow, now found rhythm again in ordinary life, but with the knowledge that vigilance is not fear, it is strength. I set small rules for my children, not to restrict them, but to honor the lessons we had learned. Check the locks. Trust intuition. Never assume that danger cannot arrive disguised in civility or wealth. Even as the immediate threats faded, Julia could not ignore the shadows entirely. I found myself driving different routes, checking on neighbors, and keeping files meticulously organized. But this vigilance was no longer rooted in panic. It was an armor forged from experience. I taught my children how to navigate the world cautiously, but without surrendering to terror. Courage, I explained, is not the absence of fear. It is the ability to act in spite of it, and I had acted, alone, in that house, against a man who thought my grief could be exploited. That act had protected my family, but it also reshaped who I was. Then came the letters of gratitude, stories from others who had experienced threats, who had been silenced by fear or wealth, who had watched injustice unfold and wondered if anyone could stand against it. They wrote to me, seeking guidance or simply reassurance that courage was possible. Each letter was a reminder that my actions had ripple effects. They were proof that when one person refuses to be intimidated, others may find the strength to do the same. Julia, once a widow shrouded in sorrow, had become a symbol of quiet defiance, an example that power does not always protect. Sometimes it corrupts, and sometimes it can be overcome. On an ordinary afternoon, as Julia prepared tea, my phone rang. It was a number I did not recognize. My instinct was caution, but curiosity pushed me to answer. A calm voice on the other end spoke, offering thanks and reassurance. It was Victor Rowan. He had survived the legal consequences, his empire tarnished but intact. He spoke of mistakes, of witnessing my courage, and of the respect it had stirred. It was strange to hear acknowledgement from the man who had once summoned me into danger. I listened, not angry, not vindictive, simply observing the strange ways that power and fear intersected with morality. Some lessons come, not in a form of revenge, but in the quiet recognition that choices define character, not status. Evening fell, and I found myself sitting beneath the tree, the wind rustling leaves above like whispers of my husband's presence. I spoke aloud, not to anyone, just to the night, expressing gratitude and sorrow, triumph and caution. My children joined me, their hands brushing mine, the bond of family sealed in shared survival. We spoke little, for words were unnecessary. The silence carried understanding, strength, and a knowledge that the worst had passed. But vigilance and courage must continue. That night, I did not sleep lightly. I slept fully, with the weight of triumph and sorrow balanced evenly in my chest, secure in the knowledge that my family would endure. In the weeks and months that followed, Julia Hale became an advocate in subtle ways. I spoke at gatherings about awareness, personal safety, and the quiet power of refusing to be intimidated. I never sought attention or glory, only to provide examples and tools for those who might one day face similar shadows. The memory of the man at Victor Rowan's estate lingered, yes, but it became a reference point rather than a haunting. It reminded me of the day I realized that ordinary courage could confront extraordinary evil. And with that knowledge, I rebuilt my life. Not the life I had lost, but a life stronger, wiser, and unshakably determined to protect what mattered most. Julia's story does not end with the defeat of one man. It continues every morning when she rises to meet the world with vigilance and love. Every time her children walk safely through doors she once feared would bring them harm, she learned that danger may arrive disguised in civility, that wealth and power can hide monstrous intent, but that clarity, courage, and the refusal to be passive can dismantle threats, no matter how insurmountable they appear. And so, as the sun set over the Hale household, the shadows that had once loomed large were reduced to lessons, carefully stored in memory, ready to guide the next chapter of life lived, fully, bravely, and without fear.